invitation. I'm delighted to be here. It looks like a great crowd. I'm honored to be invited to give this lecture. I'm going to talk about a lot of different things. I would note former Mayor Kishimoto is here, and I guess she's also an alum of the Stanford Business School. There you go. And I'm sure I have many friends in the audience. It's great to be back. I'm going to try and do three things. I'm going to talk about the nature of the world's water crisis, broadly and briefly. I'm going to talk about the concept of peak water and what I and my colleagues at the Pacific Institute mean by peak water, why I think it applies in today's world, globally and also in California. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about solutions to the world's water crises, again, in the context of the nature of our problems and in the context of peak water. To begin with, there's just not a whole lot of water on the planet. Even though we live on a water planet, there's a vast amount of water in the oceans. That's the big blue ball there. Only a small fraction of the world's water is fresh water. That's the little blue ball there, if you rolled it all up. And even that's a little misleading. Of the world's fresh water, the vast majority of it is locked up effectively out of reach of human use in the ice caps of Greenland and Antarctica, in deep groundwater, in rivers in the far north that flow into the Arctic that just for economic and political and environmental reasons is water that's not really accessible to us. The amount of fresh water on the planet that's available to us in a renewable sense is a very tiny fraction of the world's water. And even that water is badly distributed in space and time. We don't get it where we want it. We don't get it when we want it. There are rich parts, water-rich parts of the planet. There are water-poor parts of the planet. If you think about California, that's sort of the situation in California. We get all of our water in the winter months now, from November through April. We get most of it in Northern California and in the Sierra Nevada, and the demand is in Southern California mostly and along the coasts. So there's, again, this space-time discontinuity in the hydrologic cycle. And because of that, we build infrastructure. We spend billions of dollars in California and in the United States and worldwide to capture water when we get it and to move it from where we get it to where we want it. That's what we've done here in the United States. It's what we've done in the Western United States. We've built massive dams that store water in the winter months so we can use it in the dry season. We build massive aqueducts so we can move it from Northern California to Southern California or to the Central Valley where the big demand is. That's the nature of our water systems. We have the hydrologic system and we have the systems that we humans build to manage those that hydrologic cycle. So when I say there's a world water crisis, what do I mean? I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but there are a lot of components to this. I do believe there's a water crisis worldwide. I think it's manifest in different ways, in different places, at different times. But the biggest problem I see is the failure to meet basic human needs for water. We have failed as a global society, or as national governments, or as local communities. We have failed to meet basic human needs for everyone. There are perhaps 1 billion people worldwide without access to safe drinking water. There are 2.5 billion people worldwide without access to adequate sanitation services. And that's what I mean by the failure to meet basic human needs for water. We know how to provide safe, clean water. We know how to provide adequate sanitation, but we've failed to do it for a very significant fraction of the world's population. And that's a crisis all by itself. That leads directly to water-related diseases, cholera, dysentery, guinea worm, schistosomiasis, a whole series of things that are completely preventable. We know how to prevent water-related diseases, but are not prevented because we have failed to meet demands for safe water and adequate sanitation. The estimate is that there are probably 1.5 to 2 million deaths a year from preventable water-related diseases. Mostly children, mostly under the age of 5, entirely, in my opinion, preventable. And that's a crisis. Most people, when they think about the water crisis, they think, okay, it's scarcity, there's just not enough water to do the things we want to do. And that's certainly an important part of this problem. We have local water scarcity, we have resource depletion, and I'll come back to this issue of depletion in a little bit. But there are parts of the planet that are dry, where there is not enough water to do all of the things humans might want to do. If you think about northern Africa, you think about the Persian Gulf, you think about parts of the western United States that are just dry compared to other parts of the world where there are resource constraints, and I would argue growing resource constraints. There's a water quality component. We contaminate a huge amount of the fresh water that is, in theory, available to us with human wastes, with industrial wastes. They're naturally occurring contaminants that make some water resources unfit for certain kinds of human uses, such as the arsenic problem in Bangladesh and West Bengal, India. A naturally occurring arsenic, but it's arsenic that is basically at a concentration too high for most human uses. So there are all sorts of pieces of water contamination that are part of the world's water crisis. And ironically, in many parts of the world, the water quantity problem is really, in fact, a water quality problem. Parts of China now, they have sufficient water quantity, but much of that water is too contaminated to use. So there are very strong connections between quality and quantity. Climate change. Climate change is a real problem. We're already seeing clear indications that humans are changing the climate at rates far faster than naturally occurring climate change. And among the many different kinds of impacts of climate change will be impacts on the hydrologic cycle. The hydrologic cycle is evaporation, the formation of clouds, condensation, precipitation, runoff back into the oceans, evaporation. Again, that's the hydrologic cycle. That's the climate cycle. As we change the climate, we will fundamentally change water availability, the timing of storms, the intensity of storms, the quality of water in different places at different times. Snowpack in the Sierra Nevada is going to be fundamentally affected by rising temperatures. There are a whole series of very strong connections between climate change and water availability. And that's something that water managers, if I go back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, climate change will affect the natural hydrologic cycle, but it will also affect the systems that we've built or that we may want to build to manage water resources. And both of those are important challenges for the future. We use water for a lot of different things, primarily growing food. 80% of the water that's consumed by humans worldwide, and interestingly enough also in California, goes to grow food. We use water to make semiconductors, to make whatever we want to do. There are very strong connections between goods and the production of goods and services for human use and demand for water. As populations grow, as the economy grows, as challenges with quantity and quality grow, there's going to be increasing competition for water among all the different ways we use water. In particular, as the population of the world continues to grow to 7 billion and then 8 billion and then 9 billion and then I don't know what, we have to increase food production. Already 40% of the world's food production comes from irrigated agriculture. And so we're looking to increase irrigated productivity, rainfall productivity. That's a water issue in many parts of the world. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. There's an ecosystem component to this. All of the water that humans use comes out of natural ecosystems. The California water problem, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta political disputes that we hear about in the newspaper, if you pay attention to California water problems, is in large part an ecosystem problem. We take a vast amount of the water that we use in California out of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. We move it to Southern California, we move it to Central Valley for agricultural productivity, and we're already causing ecosystem collapse. The fisheries are collapsing, the wetlands are disappearing. Part of the dispute about allocations of water is a dispute about ecosystems. The Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union, terminal lake formerly fed by two big rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, completely diverted. Those rivers are completely diverted for mostly cotton production in now these 6 independent nations that used to make up the former Soviet Union part of the Aral Sea watershed. All 24 species of fish found only in the Aral Sea are now extinct. That is an ecosystem problem associated with human use of water. And of course, there are many, many other examples. And then there's politics. Water and politics are closely connected. Again, think about California, but think globally. There are many rivers that cross borders, political borders of one form or another. Again, we don't think about this too much in the United States. We have very few international neighbors, if you will. But the Colorado River, which is shared by 7 states in the western United States, is also shared by Mexico. A lot of the water demand for California is met by Colorado River water. There are a series of legal agreements, compacts, and there's a treaty, which we signed in 1944 with Mexico, allocating some water to Mexico. Water is an international issue increasingly. The Nile is shared by 10 nations. We think of the Nile as an Egyptian river, but there are 9 nations upstream of the Nile that would like to have increased use of the Nile, would like to have a greater say over management of the Nile, and that makes Egypt very nervous. The Danube in Europe is shared by 18 nations. Water and politics is a very complicated mix, and there are all sorts of connections between water and politics and conflict. And that's a whole separate talk. All right, I'm going to talk about this concept of peak water in 3 easy shapes that all of you are familiar with. Let me describe the shapes to begin with, and then I'll come back and talk about how the shapes relate to peak water. The first is the classic exponential curve that all of you are familiar with. We see the exponential curve every day. We think about it every day. Those of you who are interested in economics are interested in exponential growth. This is what you want your bank account to do, I guess. This is what economists like to see the gross national product of the United States do. I'm not sure why. Maybe an economist could explain that to me. But I would also argue that this curve, the exponential curve, is in many ways at the root of all of our problems, all of them, in one way or another. It's good in certain circumstances, but exponential growth has a tendency to get out of hand, and that's a challenge. So here's global population from 1000 AD to 2000 AD, and it shows the classic exponential curve dynamic that is slow increases and then more and more increases as the compounding part of exponential growth takes over. And then in the 20th century, it really gets out of hand, and it's part of our problem. Gross national product of the United States from 1900 to the year 2005 or so, showing, it mostly goes up. It goes down every now and then for short periods of time. Those are recessions or depressions, but exponential growth in the economy of the United States. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is the climate change problem. Again, from 1000 AD to almost the present, 2000, 2005, showing the increase in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere after the Industrial Revolution begins. I could show this for methane, I could show it for other greenhouse gases. This is the climate problem. The temperature curve of the Earth looks a lot like this over the same period because carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases drives temperature. So, exponential growth, that's one curve. Here's another curve. Again, you're all familiar with it. Exponential growth followed by a leveling off and then a peaking of something and then a decline. We see this with US oil production. And in many ways, this curve, the oil production curve in the United States, gave rise to the debate about peak oil. I'm going to talk about peak water. Obviously, the analogy is with peak oil. I don't know how many of you have studied the issue of peak oil. But in the 1960s, a petroleum hydrologist and geologist, a petroleum geologist named M. King Hubbard, wrote a paper discussing the concept of peak oil, in which he said, any oil stock, a local field, national reserves, and ultimately global production has to follow a peak oil curve. Discoveries increase the amount of oil that we think is available to us. We start production. Production grows exponentially. Costs go up as production increases and demands on the the oil stock increase. The stock eventually becomes more and more expensive and difficult to produce. We eventually run into a peak, followed by a decline. In the 1960s, Hubbard predicted that US would experience peak oil in 1970. He wrote this remarkable paper saying it would occur in 1970 or 69 or 70, and it actually occurred in 1970. Peak oil in the United States happened in 1970, and its production has dropped in the United States since then. Some resource economists and optimists like to think, well, we could increase US oil production and it would go back up again, exceeding previous peaks. Maybe. I doubt it. Even so, if that would be temporary, I think it would decline again after that. And the debate now about peak oil is, when is the global production of oil going to peak? Now, this doesn't mean we're going to run out of oil, ever. It just becomes more and more difficult to get, more and more expensive to pump. As the prices go up, we look for substitutes, and production inevitably declines. And I'll come back to that again a little bit later. Sometimes we see it for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, not natural curves, but economic curves. This is 2002 to 2009. It's come back up again, although maybe not in the last month or two. Herring catch worldwide from 1950 to 2008, and Atlantic cod, 1950 to 2008. There are all sorts of resource curves that follow this kind of increasing production, followed by a peaking, followed by a decline. Fish populations are, in theory, sustainable if you don't overfish them, but when you do overfish them, production has to drop. Populations drop, it becomes more difficult to find the stock. Whether or not these curves will recover, we don't know. That's a biological question, it's an economic question, it's a political question about fishing. Here's the third curve. Again, you're all familiar with it. It's a classic, what we call a logistics curve, increasing exponential growth in the demand for something, followed by a leveling off, and then a constant level. You're able to maintain something potentially indefinitely. A lot of technology curves follow this kind of dynamic. The penetration of telephones in the United States, somebody invents the telephone, they start to produce it, everybody decides they want one. Exponential growth in demand for telephones, and then everybody's got one or two, and it levels off. Cell phones, DVDs, they all follow this similar kind of technology penetration curve. Now, sometimes you get a replacement, and if this was landlines only, maybe it would drop off, but it would be replaced by cell phones. But this is a standard kind of technology curve. We see it for a lot of different things. I'm going to talk about this curve later, but this is total US water withdrawals in the United States for everything from 1900 to 2005. And it shows exponential growth in water demand, followed by a peaking, followed by a little bit of a decline, and then a leveling off. I'll come back to that. But all sorts of ecosystem carrying capacities follow this kind of logistics curve. There are dynamics, ups and downs, but it's a fairly standard curve. Lots of things follow the logistic dynamic. All right, so let me go back to this issue of oil again. I'll talk about oil and water together, similarities and differences, peak oil, peak water, and how they relate. And let me do it by talking about some selected characteristics of oil and water. First, the quantity. Oil is a finite resource. There's a certain amount of oil on the planet, and that's it. It's limited. We're not making any more on a time scale of interest to us. You know, maybe over millennia, millions of years, we can make more oil, but it's a limited, finite resource. So, of course, is water. If you think about that first slide, there's just a certain amount of water on the planet, but there's a lot of water on the planet. Essentially, from a human perspective, an unlimited amount of water on the planet, if we could figure out how to tap the big stock of water, that is the salt water, that at the moment is too salty for us to drink, it's too salty to use to grow crops, but there's a lot of water available at a cost, an economic cost. Renewable or non-renewable, and I'll come back to this again in a little more detail, but oil is a classic non-renewable resource. It's this stock dynamic again. There's a certain amount of oil on the planet, we're not making any more, and once we've used it up, it's not renewable. Water is in many ways the classic renewable resource, although there are some non-renewable characteristics of some kinds of water, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in a second. But it's mostly a renewable resource. Transportability. Oil is worth a lot of money. It's a nice, compact resource with a lot of energy for a small amount of volume. And because it's worth a lot of money, we move it from one place to another. We reach peak oil in the United States and production of oil in the United States drops. All right, we'll ship it from the Persian Gulf. We can afford to do that. I did the calculation the other day. If you look up the total volume of a supertanker and you fill it with oil, at today's market price, you have something worth about $200 million. An oil tanker filled with oil is worth $200 million. It's a huge amount of money. And because of that, the amount of money you have to spend to move the supertanker from there to here is pretty negligible. And so we do, we move it. If you were to fill that same supertanker with potable water, and if you were willing to pay at the end point, some city or some industrial process, the market price for oil or the backstop price for desalinating water, which is sort of the limit, if you were willing to pay that, that supertanker would be worth about $500,000 compared to $200 million. And for $500,000, it takes a lot of money to build supertankers and to operate them and to run the diesel to move water. And so we don't fill supertankers with water and move them around. We'll build a pipeline, we'll build an aqueduct, we'll move water a few hundred miles, maybe a few thousand miles. If there are mountains in the way, you have to add energy to pump it over the mountains. That's really expensive too. We don't move water around because it's not worth a lot of money, with one exception. This stuff. Now, I didn't put this here, but I'll use it as a prop. The amount of money we're willing to pay for bottled water is a huge amount of money. Is this $1, $2, maybe $3? If you're in a hotel, it's $5. That's a lot of money. When you think that the amount that you pay for the same volume of water from the tap is 1,000th of a cent. It's 1,000 times different what you're willing to pay for bottled water. So we move bottled water around. For some reason, it's economically feasible to move bottled water from Fiji to New York, or from France to Los Angeles. It's economically feasible, but that's an unusual situation, which I'm not going to talk much more about. I will say, a little plug, I've just written a book about bottled water. It'll be out in a couple of months, about the history of bottled water, about why we drink it, about the war on tap water, about bizarre bottled waters that you can buy and the claims for them. It's a fun book, and I talk about the energy implications of bottled water. But in general, long-distance transport is not an option. And substitutability. Okay, so for oil, there is nothing, pretty much, that we use oil for that we couldn't do with something else, that we couldn't do with solar power, or we couldn't do with some other liquid fuel made from biomass or from something more renewable. So there are plenty of substitutes for oil, even for liquid fuels, which is the challenge, but even for liquid fuels. There are no substitutes for water for most things. You can't grow food with anything other than water. So that's an important characteristic as well. All right, let me talk about this renewable issue for a minute. Very simply, the best way to think about a non-renewable resource is that it's stock limited. The amount of a non-renewable resource you can use depends on the stock of that resource, the amount of oil. It depends on the cost of pumping it depends on technology, all of those things. But its stock, classic definition is non-renewable resources are stock limited. And when you're out of them, you're out of them. Renewable resources, the classic definition is they're flow limited. The amount of water that I use today from a river has no effect whatsoever on the amount of water that river is going to provide for me next year. It's a hydrologic cycle. It's not affected by my use. There's a limit. I can't use any more than the natural flow provides, my ability to collect the flow. I can use all of the water in a river. And think about the Colorado River again. We, humans, use 100% of the Colorado River in an average year. We've given it all away to cities, to the 7 states, to Mexico, to cities, to farms. There's no, in an average year, no flow reaches the Gulf of California, the Colorado River Delta. It's a renewable resource. We get it again next year because storms come and it rains in the Rockies and snows in the Rockies and the watershed produces water. But it's limited by the total flow. Solar energy. Huge amount of solar energy strikes the Earth. The amount we use today has no effect on what the sun's going to produce tomorrow. And so it's limited by our ability to collect it. And sometimes those limits are high. That's one of the advantages of renewable energy systems. So renewable resources are flow limited. Interestingly, water exhibits characteristics of both. The Colorado River is a renewable resource. But there are non-renewable stocks of water, in particular what we call fossil groundwater. Groundwater that was laid down over thousands or tens of thousands of years and that we're using faster than nature recharges it. And that's just like oil. You pump it out, levels drop, it gets more and more expensive to pump it. It's non-renewable. So we have renewable water resources, we have non-renewable water resources. And part of our problem today, in fact, is that a substantial amount of the water that we use to do things that we want to do is non-renewable water. By some estimates, and we're not good at estimating these things, by some estimates, 20 or 30 or as much as 40% of the food that's grown worldwide is grown with fossil groundwater, non-renewable groundwater. It's going to get more expensive to pump, it's going to be depleted. That's a challenge, especially as populations grow and we have to grow more food with the water that we have. All right, so let me go back to this concept of peak water. And I'm going to define 3 kinds of peak water in the context of these curves that I talked about. First is peak renewable water. Again, Colorado River. Our demand on the Colorado River as populations in the West grew up until the limits of the river. And we now use the total renewable supply of the Colorado River. Now, there's variability. We have wet years, we have dry years, but within the average, we use the total renewable flow of the Colorado. And we build dams so that when we have a wet year, we can store water, extra water. So peak renewable water means you can use the total flow limit of a renewable resource. We may not want to. We may want to for political purposes or economic purposes. We may not want to for ecological reasons. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the question is, we know there are peak renewable limits, but how much should we actually use? There's also peak non-renewable water. And again, I described this already, but when we have non-renewable water resources like the Ogallala Aquifer underlying the Great Plains in the United States, the Central Valley aquifers that we're overpumping in California, northern China, parts of India, Libya is tapping non-renewable fossil groundwater. We can increase our demand, it's going to reach a peak, and then production of something is going to decline. First, water, and then the things we do with water. And we've already seen farmers in the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States shift from irrigated agriculture back to dry land farming because they can no longer afford the energy cost of pumping deeper and deeper groundwater. And we see this in India and we see it in China as well. And that's peak non-renewable water. Now I want to define a third term that my colleague Mina Palaniappan and I called peak ecological water. And we wrote a paper on this. It's available on the Institute's website. We're doing a journal article now about this as well. So on the x-axis, we have the quantity of water used. Moving from left to right, more water is used for whatever purposes humans use water. And on the y-axis, we have the value that that use of water produces. So from a purely economic point of view, the more water you use, the more economic value you get. You can grow more food with another gallon of water. You can make another semiconductor. You can do more things from an economic perspective. Now, this blue curve may not, I draw it as a straight line. It may not be, it's certainly not a straight line. It depends on what you're doing. But that's the general idea. The more you use, the more economic value you get. But if we think about ecological services as a component of this, The more water we use as we move to the right on the x-axis, the less ecological value we get. Fisheries start to suffer, ecosystems, wetlands start to disappear. You start to see a decline in ecological value produced by that water. This is the problem in the Central Valley. We've taken more and more water from the delta, from our water systems, renewable and non-renewable, to do things, to provide water for our cities and our industries and for agriculture. And as we have done that, the ecological value also formally provided by that same water starts to decline. Fisheries start to go extinct, and so on. What happens when these two curves cross? And let me redraw this curve in a different way. The x-axis is the same thing. It's the total amount of water appropriated by humans. And now the y-axis is the total value, the positive economic value and the negative ecological value produced by the use of water. We get this curve. At the very beginning, the total value, the economic value is growing very rapidly. And the ecological damage is negative, but it may not be very negative. Take a little bit of water out of ecosystems, it doesn't really matter. They're used to natural variability and flow anyway. And as we take more and more water, we reach a point at the peak where the use of one more unit of water causes more harm, ecological harm and economic value combined, than it produces economic benefit. Let me say that again. You reach a peak where the next gallon of water you use causes more harm than it provides benefit, measured as a combination of economic and ecological value. Now, I would be the first to acknowledge that we're really bad at calculating the ecological value of water. Stanford's been a place where this term ecosystem services has been explored better than anywhere else. And Gretchen Daly's work in this area and many other people's work in this area has tried to get the whole field of economics to think about ecological economics and the value of ecosystem services. We're bad at it. It's a hard thing to do. Economic systems are bad at quantifying ecological value. Be that as it may, that just means we don't really understand necessarily where this peak is. It doesn't mean the peak doesn't exist. I think it's very clear, in fact, that the peak does exist for different systems in different ways at different times, and that in many places we're past the point of peak ecological value. We're long past the point of peak ecological value in places like the Aral Sea, unless you don't value ecosystems. I would argue we're past the point of peak ecological value in California and in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. That's the idea of peak ecological water. All right, so what does peak water mean? It doesn't mean we're going to run out of water. We're never going to run out of water. Water is a renewable resource, mostly. Where water is non-renewable, we'll run into stock constraints. And ultimately, those constraints are going to be economic. Where water is renewable, we'll run into flow limits. Once you've used the Colorado River, you can't use any more. Once you've used the renewable resources available to you, you have to look somewhere else if you want to use more water. And we're increasingly hitting, or in many places exceeding, peak ecological water limits. All right. Let me talk about solutions for a few minutes. There are a lot of solutions to water problems. I'm actually, in the end, an optimist. I don't know how much pain we're going to have to go through to get to these solutions. But in the end, I think we have no choice but to move to sustainable water management and use, what I call the soft path for water. And there are a lot of components to it, and let me just go over them very quickly. But the first is we need to develop new supply. The traditional way of dealing with water is develop new supply. Build another dam on another river, capture more water, drill another aquifer, another groundwater well in an aquifer, move water from you've used your renewable limits here, find the next most distant river and build an aqueduct and move it. Traditional approaches to supply. I think, as I hope it's clear, that we're running increasingly into constraints on traditional supply. I think in the Western United States, with very few exceptions, there are no more dams to be built that make economic and political and ecological sense. I don't think there are aquifers that we could tap economically, effectively anymore. I think we're running into traditional constraints on supply. I don't think that's true in many other parts of the world. In many other parts of the world, we need much more traditional infrastructure. There's plenty of water, but it's badly managed. We don't capture it. We haven't built the dams. We haven't built the distribution systems. We need new traditional infrastructure in many places, although I would argue that we better build it to different standards that we built it in the past, when we didn't think about ecological costs. We didn't think about social and cultural costs of building big dams. We need to do that. But there are lots of things we can do on the supply side, but we need to think differently. There are other kinds of supply, though. In the Western United States, let's think about treated wastewater. We have a huge quantity of water that we collect, use, contaminate, throw away, collect and treat as wastewater, and then throw away again into the ocean. That stuff should be considered an asset, not a liability in an economic sense. Let's use highly treated wastewater for the things that it's appropriate to use highly treated wastewater for. Let's think about desalination, where it's economically and environmentally appropriate. Let's tap into what's a very high cost source of water, but it's pretty reliable if you're willing to spend the money to build it. Let's think about rainwater harvesting. Let's think about all sorts of smart use of groundwater and surface water together to refill our aquifers in wet seasons. The smartest new reservoir in California is groundwater aquifers that we've overpumped. If we can recharge them in wet years, which is what we do with surface storage, if we can recharge our groundwater aquifers, that's a smart source of new storage. All right. Lots of places we've built water infrastructure, but it needs to be maintained to a better standard than we're maintaining it. Let's expand infrastructure where we don't have it. Let's maintain to a better level the infrastructure we have. In the United States, we have pretty high quality tap water. It's one of the reasons why this bottled water is sort of a strange thing. But there are also places in the United States where people don't like the taste of their tap water, where we have increasing concerns about new contaminants. We know how to provide incredibly high quality, cheap tap water with existing technology, but maybe it needs an investment of new infrastructure. In general, we need to improve the efficiency of water use. In a place like California, where we're at the limits of our water supply, we're not at the limits of our efficiency. Everything that we do in California, we could do more efficiently. We could grow more food with less water. We could flush our toilets and wash our clothes with less water. We could produce our semiconductors with less water. We could run our cooling systems in our industry with less water. When we talk about efficiency, and the Pacific Institute's done a lot of work quantifying urban and agricultural efficiency, we don't mean shorter showers and brown lawns. Those are things you do in an emergency. We mean improving efficiency, doing the things we want with less water. And there's enormous potential for that. And I'll come back to that again one more time. Let's improve our standards for water quality, and let's enforce the standards we have. There's a lot that we could do to make our water cleaner, to prevent contamination in the first place, and to clean up water after it's contaminated. When we have standards, let's enforce them. Part of our water quality problems in the United States isn't because we don't have water quality laws. It's because we've stopped enforcing those standards. Let's enforce them. Let's use economics. Water is an economic good. It's also a human right. But how do we balance the human right to water and the economic good component of water resources? That's a challenge. There are equity issues. There are pricing questions. There are good subsidy versus bad subsidy questions. A lot of the problems we have with water in the Western United States are the result of old subsidies that encourage farmers to grow things that are water intensive. But because of the subsidies, make economic sense. So, of course, they grow them. Part of the problem in California is we don't price water properly. Believe it or not, there are urban areas in California where we don't meter water still. And we almost nowhere in California do we meter agricultural water. So it's pretty hard to apply economics to water that you don't measure or meter. So let's use proper pricing, let's use markets where it makes sense, but let's do it in an equitable way. Let's improve and expand public participation in decision-making about water, the kinds of choices we make about water. Let's fix our water institutions. I could talk forever about that. We have a lot of different kinds of water institutions, but many of them were designed in the 19th and 20th century, and I would argue they're not necessarily the best institutions for dealing with our 21st century water problems. So I said I would come back to this. This is this graph I showed in the logistics curve graph. This is the gross national product of the United States in the blue curve, in the red curve, from 1900 to 2005, and total water withdrawals in the United States in the blue curve over the same period. For the beginning of the century, the demand for water grew exponentially with population, which isn't shown here but is the same as the red curve, and with our economy. It was what water managers are trained and engineers are trained to assume, and planners are trained to assume. Population grows exponentially, our economy grows exponentially, our demand for resources must grow exponentially. And sure enough, for the first 3/4 of the century, that's what happened. And then something weird happened in 1980, around the 1980s. We split those curves apart, and the demand for water today in the United States for everything is lower than it was in 1980. The demand for water for everything, for cooling power plants and growing food and flushing our toilets and making semiconductors, everything, is less than it was in 1980. And the per capita demand for water is much less than it was in 1980 because populations continue to grow exponentially. We've somehow managed to split apart the curves. So the assumption, our population's growing exponentially, our demand for our economy's growing exponentially, therefore our demand for water must also grow exponentially. That assumption is wrong, in my opinion. And that assumption drives a lot of the mismanagement of water. So think for a minute, if that blue curve had continued to follow the red curve, think how much more additional water we would have had to find from groundwater systems, from surface water systems, from expensive desalination, if we hadn't split those curves apart. It would have been huge. We couldn't have done it, I think, without completely destroying ecosystems, without huge increases in the price of water and goods and services. So it's a good thing that we split those curves apart. So I'd like to raise the question, in the United States, are we past the point of peak renewable water? Now, sure, we could tap more rivers to some degree, we could tap more groundwater in some places, but overall, have we reached the point of peak renewable water? Not total peak water, we're not tapping all of the water, but from an economic point of view, because that's part of this, from an ecological point of view, that's part of this. Are we actually likely to be in a situation where that curve may go up a little more, may go down as we improve efficiency, as we change the structure of our economy, but I'd like to think that maybe we've reached peak water in the United States. Not everywhere, not every region, not every water district, but overall. So, yes, there's a real water crisis. It takes a lot of different forms in different places, different times. We're never going to run out of water. Water is mostly a renewable resource, but we are past the point of peak water, renewable, non-renewable, and ecological water in many places. And in some places, those constraints are beginning to affect agricultural production, industrial production, and increasingly politics. I think there are lots of opportunities for solutions. I think there's lots of innovation out there. I think there's all sorts of good news that drove that curve flat in the United States in terms of improving efficiency and changing the dynamics of our economy and our demand for water. In terms of restoring ecosystems, I think that's now a fundamental part of the discussion. But in some places, it's going to require new thinking and new approaches. In the end, truly sustainable water management and use is going to require improved efficiency. It's going to require smart economics. It's going to require better application of existing technology and in some cases advanced technology for monitoring and metering and irrigation use and so on. and better governance and management. You can't solve our water problems without dealing with the institutional challenges as well. And so our goal in the end is to go from this kind of a curve to this kind of a curve. I think we can do it. I think we'll ultimately do it. I just don't know how much pain and suffering we'll have to go through to get there. Thank you very much. Yes, that's a great question. I could have just put one slide up and talked about this curve. It's a great curve. There's a huge amount hidden in this curve. A large reason for the leveling off of productivity is improved efficiency. We're making more steel with less water. We're growing more food with less water. Our toilets are 1.6 gallon per flush toilets or 1.2 gallon per flush toilets instead of 6 gallon per flush toilets. It's the efficiency issue. Part of it is this change in the structure of our economy. We are moving to more of a computer, technology, communication, service industry that produces more dollars per unit water. We're a big agricultural exporter. So it's in fact not that we haven't made up what would have been the difference with imports. That's not going on. We do import water in the goods and services we import, but we export more water than we import in the United States because it's dominated by agriculture. It's a combination of all of those things. Part of the leveling off is agriculture. There's no more land, really, that we can bring into irrigated agriculture. I think but our productivity, we're producing more food because we're doing it with drip irrigation and sprinklers rather than flood. That's improved, but it is largely agricultural leveling off. Yeah.
The thing about peak oil, at least globally, is that it's been kind of revised upwards over like 20 times because technology's just kind of saved the day each time. Do you think that that'll be the case with water, so kind of putting efficiency and a lot of the other solutions aside? Do you think technology kind of will save the day? And if so, like, will it be desal, or kind of what technologies are most promising?
Yeah, the debate about peak oil, in my opinion, the legitimate piece of the debate about peak oil is not if. I think that's a ridiculous debate. It's when. And when depends on the price of oil, technology for getting oil, the cost of substitutes. You know, eventually, if the price of oil goes up enough, it's more expensive than doing other things. And so, in the end, I think it's just a question of when we reach peak oil and production will drop. It won't drop to zero, but it'll drop. For water, it's more complicated because of the renewable characteristics, because of the ecological component of water. Without a doubt, globally, demand for water is still growing, and it needs to grow because there are many parts of the world where we're not using enough water. We need to grow more food. We need to meet basic human needs for water. As industries and economies grow, the demand for water for industrial use grows. I think there will be continued growth in demand for water worldwide. But the population of the world is slowing. The growth in the population of the world is slowing. I think we will reach peak population at some point. 2050, 2060, it'll be 9 billion or 10 billion. I don't know what it'll be. But if there's any good news in the bad news of the resource environment world, it's that. And that once we reach peak population, and knowing that we can improve efficiency, ultimately, I think there's no choice, but the globe will reach peak water as well. Water will be more expensive. The demand for water will be higher. Some of it will be expensive desalinated water to meet demands in regions that don't have natural, renewable fresh water. I think all of those are components, but I think peak water is inevitable.
Speaking about good news and the bad news, you mentioned in your first slide about how most of the fresh water is locked up in ice. So what are we doing about capturing that? We hear a lot about global climate change causing the Greenland ice sheets to raise sea levels. Why can't we capture that and use it to supply?
Oh, okay, that's right. In fact, one of the big concerns in the hydrologic community is how fast we're melting these large quantities of land-based fresh water locked up in ice caps. Greenland ice melt seems to be accelerating. Part of Antarctica is accelerating, but not all of it. It varies. Part of the problem is that stuff's really hard to capture. It runs off into the ocean really right away. It's expensive. You know, they talked in the 70s about capturing icebergs and towing them. You know, sure, we could do that, but it's really expensive to do that. So we're not going to capture large amounts of glacial melt from Greenland and Antarctica for freshwater purposes. It's going to run off into the ocean. It's going to get salty. We may desalinate it. We'll capture it that way. But very tiny amounts of water compared to the large volumes. I mean, Greenland melts, we're talking about 7 meters of sea level rise. 7 meters of sea level rise. Antarctica melts, we're talking about 20 meters of sea level rise. We're not going to solve our water problems that way.
Comment on the management of aquifers, particularly in China and India, and also, is subsidence a serious problem, or is that overblown?
We manage groundwater almost everywhere badly. In California, there is no groundwater law. There's no groundwater management, no groundwater law. You drill a well, you can pump groundwater. And we don't measure groundwater withdrawals, except for a very few basins where there's been enough political controversy over allocation of water that they've adjudicated them. They've agreed in court to allocate water resources. And so we see overpumping. It's a classic tragedy of the commons. And we see that in India and we see it in northern China, where we overpump groundwater for economic purposes. In India, the problem is part because electricity is provided to farmers for free. So the cost of, they don't really see the cost of pumping, and so groundwater levels are dropping. Whether or not land subsides over groundwater aquifers that are overpumped depends on the geology. Parts of the Central Valley have seen enormous subsidence, and those aquifers can't be recharged. Other parts of the Central Valley, the groundwater goes down, but you can recharge them, and they recharge naturally in really wet years. And so that's partly a geology and management problem. But as long as we're not managing groundwater in a sustainable way, we're going to run into non-renewable peak water in a lot of places.
I've heard that,
Right here.
I'm sorry.
What are the solutions that people have been bandying about as privatizing water? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah. We actually wrote a paper at the Pacific Institute on privatizing water called The New Economy of Water that describes a lot of the issues around that, pros and cons. There are pros and cons. There are a lot of definitions of privatization. This is one form of privatization. Another is private companies come in and operate water systems, municipal water systems that used to be public systems. In the United States, about 15% of the US population gets its water from private water systems. But 85% of the US population gets its water from public water agencies. That's for historical reasons, the way we developed our systems. In England, water systems have been privatized. Margaret Thatcher privatized water systems in the 70s. The French have a mix of public and private water systems. It's a big question. There are pros and there are cons. Water's a public good, it's an economic good, and balancing those is a difficult thing. In the paper we did, we laid out a series of principles for managing water in a way to protect the public interest aspect of water. It's a great question. It's a big one, and I could talk about it for a long time. But the big fights in the water world are often about privatization in one form or another.
I've heard it estimated that we lose about 40% of the water that's transported down the aqueduct due to leakage and evaporation. Would you think that would be an accurate estimate?
No, I think that's way too high. The big aqueducts are lined with concrete. They no longer, they didn't all used to be lined, but they're increasingly lined to prevent seepage losses. You do lose some water to evaporation, but it's not a huge amount. The biggest evaporative loss is flood irrigation. A large fraction of the crops in California are still flood irrigated, which means you open the gates and the water spills out onto the field and the crop goes into soil moisture and the crops evapotranspire. But a lot of that water is what we call unproductive evaporative loss. It evaporates and goes back to the hydrologic cycle. And that's partly the reason we argue for a shift in irrigation technology from flood irrigation on those crops that can permit it to precision sprinklers or drip. You lose less in unproductive evaporation. You lose less in seepage to sinks that you can't recover water. So overall, there is a lot of seepage and evaporative loss from the system, but it's not all from the big aqueducts that you see driving down the state, Route 5. So, in the back.
Globally, is there water scarcity in an economic sense? If you look at the inflation-adjusted price of water over time, has it gone up or down?
Well, you know, we don't have markets for water in many places. People don't pay a price for water. In general, in where we do pay for water services, the price of water is going up, inflation adjusted. And it's going up in part because a long time ago, we weren't covering full costs. Water was subsidized. It's still very heavily subsidized for a lot of users, but increasingly less so. And for that reason, the price of water is going up. I pay almost the full economic value of my water at home. I don't pay the ecological damage because we haven't figured out how to capture that. But I pay the full cost of building the system, paying for the fixed costs, paying the operation maintenance costs, paying the wastewater treatment costs for my water agency. That's increasingly happening. The industrial price of water is going up, and it's still a relatively low cost of production in many industries, so industries are willing to pay for it. So I think the way we think about the economics of water is changing, and we're moving toward proper economics in pricing of water.
Yeah, how much do you associate the Clean Water Act and the associated cost of cleaning up and treating water, not so much the cost coming in, but the cost coming out with the leveling that agency?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I should have mentioned it. Partly what happened in the 1980s was the Clean Water Act. Prior to the Clean Water Act, industries and cities dumped water untreated, mostly. And we had Lake Erie and the Cuyahoga River caught fire in '69, and Lake Erie was dying. We had problems with water quality, so we passed the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And the Clean Water Act said to industries, thou shalt not dump untreated industrial wastes anymore. You have to start treating your wastes. And it turned out one of the cheapest ways to meet the standards of the Clean Water Act was not to collect your wastewater and treat it, but not to produce it in the first place, to become more efficient, to reduce the volume of discharge. So the steel industry could have treated huge volumes of contaminated water, but they decided they could produce steel with less water. And that was true in industries across the United States, and that's partly what drove down the curve. It's only a part of it, because a lot of it was agriculture, a lot of it was power plant cooling and the build out of systems. I mean, it's a complicated curve. That's why I said I could have just talked about this one curve, but it was part of the dynamic.
Peter, you're talking about strengthening institutions. Can you tell us a handful of institutions that you think are doing progressive water policy in the United States that are worth supporting, either nonprofits or government agencies?
I'm not hesitating because there's no answer to that. I'm hesitating because it's a tough question. We manage water in a lot of different ways. Water's a national issue, and it's all often a really local issue. So my water is managed by a local water district that's figured out how to collect and treat and deliver high quality water to me and collect my wastewater and treat it. And I think my water agency and many urban water agencies in California are pretty good. They've figured out how to improve efficiency. They've figured out how to recycle and reclaim and reuse water. They've figured out how to deal with pricing, largely. At the federal level, there are 20-odd agencies that deal with some aspect of water. USAID has international aid devoted to basic human needs for water. The Department of the Interior manages water with the Bureau of Reclamation. Department of Agriculture is interested in water and food production. The USGS does water quality, groundwater testing, and water use measurement. The NOAA does research on climate change and water. There's a huge diversity of institutions that manage water. And I think overall, we're getting better at thinking about the complex nature of water. There are success stories at all levels where somebody's figured out how to fix a water problem that we caused in the 20th century with new technology or new infrastructure or markets and economics. There's lots of good news out there. So there are lots of examples. The Institute's we're about to release, you can go back to this. PACINS.org is the Institute's website. All of our publications are available for free, for download there, including some papers on water use efficiency in the urban and agricultural sector. Some of those papers have examples of success stories. We're also about to release a new set of studies on agricultural success stories in California. Farmers that are doing innovative things. They're moving to efficient technology, or they're using better soil moisture monitoring, or they're working with irrigation districts to restore ecosystems around the margins of their farms. So there's lots of good news out there.
So in the developing world, are there any models that, approach some sort of theoretical gold standard, or even what's the best region or country that's managing their water resources?
Again, part of my answer would be no one's doing it all right, but part of my answer is there's all sorts of incredible things going on out there. South Africa, when they threw out the apartheid government in the early 1990s, had a chance to do what, unfortunately, we're not going to have a chance to do, I think, in California, for example. And that is they threw out their old water laws, and they threw out their old water rights, which had been developed under the apartheid regime. They rewrote their constitution guaranteeing basic human needs for water and basic ecosystems for water. That's in the South African Constitution. And they then said, let's have a national discussion about the rest of the water. We allocate water for ecosystems for basic needs and humans for basic needs. Let's argue then in a public way about who gets the rest for the mining and the agricultural use and the urban use. They've done some amazing things in South Africa. Australia's just coming out of a horrible 9-year drought. And they've been forced to do things in terms of efficiency and water rights allocations and pricing and rethinking urban lawns and things like that we aren't doing in California. People scream that there's a crisis of water in California, but not compared to what's happened in Australia. We're not anywhere near as efficient as we could be if we were really forced by nature or other circumstances to rethink the things we do. So there are all sorts of great examples from Australia. There are interesting examples in India of local watershed rainwater harvesting to capture runoff and recharge groundwater aquifers that have been overpumped. Some of them are in the movie Flow, which you and I talked about earlier. The movie Thirst describes some of these examples in different regions. There are all sorts of good stories out there.
Last question.
In terms of your soft path solutions to, or approaches to working with water resource issues, have you or others done some basic cost-benefit analysis on various solutions? And if so, where does sanitation fit in there? Because I have a hunch that sanitation would be in a lot of places would be a low-cost and high marginal contribution to water supply issues, but I don't know if that's right or not.
Yeah, we do look at economics of water options all the time. Partly it depends, the answer to your question depends on which problem you're trying to solve. If it's basic human needs for water, what you would do in a peri-urban area that doesn't have infrastructure is different than what you might do in a rural setting where there's access to groundwater or contaminated surface water. What you might do in a rural setting in sub-Saharan Africa might be different than what you would do in a rural setting in the Western United States or in India. So a lot of it depends on the specific regional characteristics, hydrologic, social, cultural characteristics of a place. For sanitation, solving water-related disease problems is a combination of providing basic sanitation, which could be anything from pit toilets to flush toilets. I have to say the flush toilet, it's a great invention. We all love our flush toilets, but it's also a great way to contaminate a lot of water really quickly. And so we then have to collect it and we have to treat, anyway. But there are all sorts of innovative sanitation solutions that have been proven to improve public health enormously. Now, the sanitation problem is combined with in the world of water, you have to talk about water supply, you have to talk about sanitation, you have to talk about hygiene education together. All of those things combined you can't just do one without doing the other. But there are lots of low-cost solutions out there. I don't think it's a problem of money, I guess, is the answer. We can solve our water problems with technology and the financial situation we have. We just have failed to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.